The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Sarah Whitmore stepped onto her porch, rifle cradled in the crook of her arm like a sleeping child. She scanned the horizon with the practiced eye of someone who had learned that survival meant noticing everything, trusting nothing. The way station squatted in the dust like a defiant fist, its wooden walls bleached grey by years of unforgiving sun, its well the only reason anyone bothered to acknowledge its existence. 9 years alone had carved lines around her eyes that had nothing to do with smiling. Her husband, Thomas, rested under a crooked cross 1/2 mile east, taken by fever the winter of '38. She had been 38 herself then, still young enough to imagine starting over, still foolish enough to believe the future held something besides more dust and more silence. Now, at 47, she knew better. The territory was bleeding from a war that had no clear sides anymore, just blood and retribution, and an endless cycle of violence that made her way station feel less like a home and more like a target, waiting for the right moment to be destroyed. She poured herself coffee from the pot she had brewed before dawn, bitter and strong enough to scour away the remnants of restless dreams. The taste was familiar, almost comforting in its harshness. Most mornings passed this way, wrapped in routine, insulated by the careful distance she kept from hope. But this morning felt different. The air carried a tension she could not name, a thickness that made the hairs on her forearms rise. By noon, she understood why. Dust appeared on the eastern road, a thin plume that grew thicker as she watched. 2 riders, moving slowly, one slumped forward against the neck of his horse. Sarah's hand tightened on the rifle, her body moving to the defensive position she had practiced 1,000 times. Strangers meant danger. Strangers meant choices she did not want to make. They came closer, and details emerged from the haze. Confederate grey, or what had once been grey before the sun, and the blood had faded it to something closer to ash. The upright rider was tall, lean, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He held the reins of both horses, his free arm wrapped around his companion to keep the wounded man from sliding to the ground. As they approached the gate, he raised one hand slowly, palm out, the universal gesture of surrender. Sarah did not lower her rifle. She watched them with the cold assessment of someone who had seen too much kindness punished, too much trust rewarded with betrayal. The tall man stopped his horse 10 feet from her porch, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with thirst and something deeper, something that might have been desperation tempered by pride. "Ma'am, we need water. My friend's hurt bad. We're not here to cause trouble." She studied them in silence. The wounded man was younger, maybe 30, with dark hair plastered to his skull by sweat and fever. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage wrapped around his torso, spreading in a dark stain that spoke of hours, maybe days, of suffering. The tall one met her gaze without flinching, and she saw exhaustion there, bone deep and honest. She saw something else too, something that looked like decency clinging to the edges of a man who had been worn down to his essential parts. If you were this woman living alone for years, watching a war devour everything around you, would you let 2 strangers step into your life on a day like this? Sarah made her choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She lowered the rifle slightly, nodded toward the barn. "Tie your horses in the shade. I'll bring water." The relief that crossed the tall man's face was so profound it almost embarrassed her. He dismounted carefully, moving with the stiffness of someone who had been in the saddle too long, and helped his companion down with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the rough edges of his appearance. Sarah turned away before she could reconsider, walking to the well with measured steps that betrayed none of the conflict churning beneath her ribs. She drew water, cold and clean, and filled a bucket. When she returned to the barn, the tall man had settled his friend on a pile of hay, removing the blood-stained coat with careful hands. The wounded man groaned, half-conscious, his skin pale beneath the grime and the fever flush. "Thank you, ma'am." the tall one said, accepting the dipper she offered. He drank first, not gulping despite the obvious thirst, then brought water to his friend's lips, coaxing him to swallow. "My name's Elijah. This here's Marcus. We've been riding 3 days with nothing but dust and heat." Sarah crouched beside them, setting the bucket within reach. "I'm Sarah Whitmore. This is my land, such as it is. That wound needs tending if he's going to make it through the night." Elijah looked up at her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. "You've done enough already. I can't ask you for more. You didn't ask. I'm telling you what needs to happen." She stood, brushing hay from her skirt. "I'll get supplies. You keep him quiet and still." She returned to the house, her mind already cataloguing what she had. Whiskey for cleaning the wound, clean cloth for bandages, needle and thread if the damage required stitching. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of gathering supplies, but her thoughts raced ahead to the complications this kindness would bring. 2 Confederate cowboys, assuming that's what they were, hiding on her property. If the army came through, or worse, if the Apache scouts found them, she would be marked as a collaborator. The territory had no patience for neutrality, but she had made her choice, and Sarah Whitmore did not unmake choices lightly. Back in the barn, she found Elijah kneeling beside Marcus, murmuring something too low for her to hear. The intimacy of the moment made her pause, made her recognize that these 2 men shared something deeper than simple companionship. She cleared her throat, and Elijah straightened, moving aside to give her space. "I need to see the wound," she said, her voice brisk and professional. Together, they eased Marcus onto his back. Sarah peeled away the makeshift bandage, revealing an angry hole just below his ribs on the right side. The flesh around it was swollen and hot to the touch, the early signs of infection already taking hold. She poured whiskey over the wound, and Marcus jerked awake with a strangled cry, his eyes wild with pain and confusion. "Hold him," Sarah commanded, and Elijah obeyed instantly, pinning Marcus's shoulders with a strength that was gentle despite its firmness. She probed the wound carefully, feeling for the bullet. It was lodged deep, too deep for her to extract without causing more damage. "I can clean it, bind it tight, but the bullet stays in. He needs a surgeon, and the nearest one is 3 days' ride north." "He won't make it 3 days," Elijah said quietly, and Sarah heard the grief already settling into his words. "Maybe not, but he won't make it 3 hours if we don't try." She threaded the needle, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was about to do. "This is going to hurt him, and you're going to have to keep him still." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. Sarah worked quickly, stitching the wound closed as best she could, cleaning away the blood and the dirt, binding it with strips of clean cloth. Marcus screamed once, a sound that tore through the barn and seemed to echo across the empty desert, and then he went limp, unconscious from the pain. Elijah held him even after the work was done, his face buried against his friend's shoulder, and Sarah turned away to give him privacy for whatever grief or relief he needed to express. She left them there, returning to the house as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Inside, she prepared a simple meal, more than she usually bothered with for herself, and tried not to think about the choices compounding around her like debts she had no way to repay. Night came fast in the high desert, swallowing the last light in great gulps of shadow. Sarah carried food and more water to the barn, finding Elijah sitting beside Marcus, watching his friend's chest rise and fall with shallow, irregular breaths. The fever had him now, fully and completely, and his skin glistened with sweat despite the cooling air. "Eat," Sarah said, handing Elijah a plate. "You can't help him if you collapse." Elijah took the plate, but did not touch the food. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah considered the question, considered all the answers she could give. "Because I'm tired of death. Because I used to believe in something better. Because refusing would make me one more piece of the cruelty that's devouring this place. Instead," she said, "because you asked for water, and I have water. The rest followed. That's simple? Nothing's simple, but sometimes we pretend it is, so we can sleep at night." She settled onto a bale of hay across from him, her own plate balanced on her knees. "Where were you headed? Anywhere that isn't here. Marcus and we fought for the wrong side, or maybe the right side, depending on who you ask. Either way, the war's over for us. We just want to disappear into some quiet corner and be left alone." Sarah understood that desire with an intimacy that made her chest ache. The territory doesn't have many quiet corners left. "I'm starting to understand that." Elijah finally took a bite of food, chewing slowly, and she could see the hunger he had been ignoring. "You live here alone?" 9 years now. My husband died and I stayed. Didn't seem to be anywhere else to go." "That's a long time to be alone." "It's a long time to be anything." She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "I'll check on you both in the morning. If his fever breaks, he might have a chance." She left before Elijah could respond, retreating to the house and the familiar solitude of her own bed. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the awareness of strangers on her land, of choices that could not be undone, of a future that had suddenly become far less predictable than it had been that morning. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses. Not the familiar sounds of her own animals, but the purposeful approach of riders who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the grey, pre-dawn light she saw them. 3 Apache scouts, sitting their horses just beyond her fence line, their eyes fixed on the barn. Sarah stepped onto the porch, rifle visible but not raised, her body language carefully neutral. The lead scout was a man she had seen before, though they had never spoken. His name was Takoda, and his reputation preceded him. Ruthless, intelligent, and utterly committed to defending Apache land from the endless encroachment of settlers. He wore his hair long, decorated with feathers and beads, and his face bore the scars of a lifetime spent fighting. "You have 2 men in your barn," Takoda said, his English accented but clear. "We have been tracking them." Sarah's mind raced through her options. Lying would be pointless. The scouts had clearly seen enough to know the truth. Defending the cowboys would mark her as an enemy. Surrendering them would make her complicit in whatever violence followed. She chose the only path that seemed to offer any dignity. "I gave them water and shelter. One is badly wounded. They're no threat to anyone." Takoda studied her with eyes that gave away nothing. "They are soldiers. Soldiers are always a threat. They're men. Hurt men who asked for help." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I'm offering you the same. Water from my well if you want it. No strings, no debts." The other 2 scouts exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the offer. Takoda remained still, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, taut with the potential for violence or something else, something Sarah could not quite name. Finally, Takoda dismounted. He walked to the well, with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body, and Sarah followed, setting her rifle aside in a gesture of trust that felt both reckless and necessary. She drew water, filled the dipper, and offered it to him. He drank slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and she understood that this moment was a test, a negotiation conducted without words. When he finished, he handed the dipper back. "Your kindness is unusual. Maybe, or maybe everyone else has just forgotten what kindness looks like." Takoda almost smiled, a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He called to his companions in Apache, a language Sarah did not understand, and they dismounted as well, approaching the well with a caution that spoke of countless betrayals. She gave them water too, watching as they drank and refilled their canteens. "The wounded one will not survive," Takoda said, matter of fact. "Maybe not, but I'm going to try to save him anyway." "Why?" Sarah considered the question, the same question Elijah had asked hours earlier. "Because giving up is easy." "I'm tired of easy." Takoda studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will camp beyond your fence tonight. Tomorrow we leave. What happens to the soldiers is your responsibility." "Understood." The scouts mounted their horses and rode to the edge of her property. settling into positions that made it clear they were standing watch, not leaving. Sarah returned to the barn, where she found Elijah awake and alert, his body tense with the awareness of danger. "I heard voices," he said. "Apache scouts. They know you're here. They're not going to kill you, at least not tonight, but they're not gone either." She checked Marcus's wound, finding the bandage soaked with fresh blood and something that might have been pus. The infection was spreading. "We need to get his fever down." They worked together through the morning, sponging Marcus with cool water, forcing him to drink when he was conscious enough to swallow, changing bandages and cleaning the wound with a diligence born of desperation. Elijah moved with a quiet competence, following Sarah's instructions without question, and she found herself appreciating his presence in a way that surprised her. By midday, Marcus's fever had dropped slightly, enough to give them a sliver of hope. He woke briefly, his eyes focusing on Elijah with recognition and something deeper, something that made Elijah's hand tighten on his. "Still here," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Still here," Elijah confirmed, his thumb brushing across Marcus's knuckles. "You're going to be fine." Sarah looked away, giving them privacy, and found her gaze drifting to the window, to the Apache scouts visible in the distance. The situation was impossible, a powder keg waiting for the wrong spark. But for now, in this fragile moment, there was something close to peace. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Sarah divided her time between the house and the barn, between her own routine and the constant care Marcus required. Elijah helped with chores, repairing the broken fence rail she had been ignoring for months, clearing the irrigation ditch, hauling water for the horses. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable, the kind of quiet that came from mutual respect rather than awkwardness. The Apache scouts remained at the edge of her property, their presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of the situation. Dakota visited the well twice more, accepting water with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. On his third visit, Sarah asked him why they stayed. "We watch to see what you will do," he said simply. "Your actions will determine whether your kindness is real or simply another trick. And if it's real, then perhaps there is hope for something other than endless war." Marcus's condition improved slowly, painfully. The fever came and went in waves, leaving him weak and disoriented. But the wound began to close, the infection retreating under Sarah's relentless care. Elijah never left his side for long, and Sarah watched their dynamic with a curiosity she tried to suppress. There was love there, obvious and unashamed, and it stirred something in her she had thought long dead. One evening, as the three of them sat in the barn sharing a meal, Marcus spoke for the first time in days, beyond single-word responses. "Why are you helping us?" His voice was rough but stronger. "You don't know us. We could be anyone." Sarah set down her plate, considering her answer. "I was married once. Thomas was a good man, better than I deserved. When he died, I thought I died too, at least the parts that mattered. I've been going through the motions for 9 years, surviving but not living. You two showed up, and something in me woke up. Maybe it's foolish, maybe I'll regret it, but I'd rather be foolish than dead inside." Elijah looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You're not foolish. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." The compliment settled around her like a warm blanket, unexpected and welcome. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, a blush she had not experienced in years, and looked away to hide it. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah stood on her porch and watched the stars wheel overhead. The air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Elijah approaching, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Too much on my mind." He leaned against the porch railing, his shoulder close to hers, but not touching. "Marcus is getting better. We'll need to move on soon. Stop imposing on your hospitality." "You're not imposing." "Still, we've brought you nothing but trouble." Sarah considered this, considered the Apache scouts camped just beyond her fence, the danger that lingered like smoke in the air. Maybe, but you've also reminded me that I'm still capable of caring about something other than just getting through another day. That's worth more than you know. Elijah turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes seemed to hold entire universes. You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Whitmore. The way he said her name, with a reverence that felt almost like prayer, made her breath catch. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the sudden fierce desire to close the small distance between them. But she held herself still, afraid that moving would shatter the moment, afraid that wanting something might somehow curse it. "I'm just a woman who gave you water," she said quietly. "No. You're someone who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. You're someone who risked everything for strangers. That's not ordinary." They stood in silence, the space between them charged with possibilities neither seemed ready to name. Finally, Elijah straightened, stepping back, and the spell broke. "Good night, Sarah. Good night." She watched him return to the barn, then remained on the porch long after he disappeared inside, her heart beating with a rhythm she had almost forgotten. The next morning brought visitors of a different kind. Sarah was drawing water when she heard the sound of wagon wheels and looked up to see a familiar shape approaching from the west. Her neighbor, Ezra Callahan, drove his wagon with the same aggressive confidence he applied to everything, his broad frame taking up most of the bench, his face red from sun and probably whiskey. Behind him rode two of his ranch hands, both armed, both watching her property with obvious interest. Sarah's stomach tightened. Ezra had made his intentions clear more than once over the years, offering to buy her land for a fraction of its value, suggesting she would be better off marrying again and letting a man handle the difficult work of running a way station. She had refused him politely at first, then less politely, and finally with the blunt edge of her rifle across her knee. But Ezra Callahan was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully. He pulled his wagon to a stop at her gate, not bothering to dismount, his eyes sweeping across her property with proprietary interest. "Morning, Sarah. Heard you've got some visitors." "News travels fast," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Everything travels fast in this territory. Confederate deserters, from what I hear, and Apache camped on your fence line. You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not playing anything. I gave water to people who needed it. That's all." Ezra snorted. "That's all. You hear that, boys? That's all." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Let me make this simple for you, Sarah. This war has everyone on edge. The army comes through here and finds you harboring deserters. They'll burn this place to the ground. The Apache decide you're collaborating with soldiers. Same result. You're putting a target on your own back. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle my own affairs." "Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're about to get yourself killed over a couple of strangers who'll be gone the minute they're able." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm offering you a way out. Sell me this land. Take the money. Move somewhere safe. I'll even throw in extra for your trouble." Sarah felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and bright. "This is my home. I'm not selling." "You're a stubborn woman. Always have been. Thomas spoiled you, let you think you could manage on your own. But look around, Sarah. You're barely scraping by. How much longer can you keep this up?" Before she could respond, Elijah appeared from the barn, moving with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. His presence changed the dynamic instantly, adding a threat that Ezra could not ignore. "The lady said she's not selling," Elijah said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the distance. Ezra's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't concern you, boy. It concerns me if you're threatening her." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm offering help." Ezra's gaze shifted back to Sarah. "Think about what I said. This offer won't stand forever." He snapped the reins, turning his wagon around with unnecessary force, and rode off with his men trailing behind. Sarah watched them disappear into the heat shimmer, her hands clenched into fists. Elijah approached slowly, stopping beside her. "He'll be back. I know. And next time, he might not come alone with just an offer." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. "Ezra Callahan has wanted this land for years. He thinks I'm too weak to hold it." "Then he's a fool." The simple conviction in Elijah's voice steadied her. She turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing past the rough exterior to the solid core of decency beneath. "Thank you for coming out. You've done more for us than we can ever repay. The least I can do is stand with you when someone tries to push you around." Standing with you. The phrase echoed in her mind. Awakening a longing she had suppressed for so long, it felt almost foreign. She wanted someone to stand with her, wanted to not face every threat and every hardship alone, but wanting felt dangerous, felt like opening a door she had sealed shut, for good reason. They walked back to the barn together, and Sarah found Marcus sitting up, his color better, his eyes clear. He smiled when he saw them, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "I'm feeling almost human again," he said, "thanks to you both." Sarah checked his wound, pleased to find the flesh healing cleanly, the infection finally conquered. "You're going to make it. Another week and you'll be strong enough to travel." A week. Marcus glanced at Elijah, some unspoken communication passing between them. "We've already imposed too long." "Stay as long as you need," Sarah heard herself say, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "At least until you're fully healed." That evening, Takoda appeared at her door, alone this time, his posture indicating he came in peace. Sarah invited him in, offering coffee which he accepted with a slight nod. They sat at her small table, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but weighted with significance. "The soldiers are improving," Takoda observed. "Yes, Marcus is healing well, and still you shelter them, though it brings you danger." Sarah wrapped her hands around her own cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "I made a choice. I'm seeing it through. Your neighbor wants your land. He's wanted it for years." Takoda studied her face, his dark eyes missing nothing. "He will take it, if you give him the opportunity. Men like that always do." "Then I won't give him the opportunity. You are one woman against many dangers. The soldiers cannot stay forever to protect you." Sarah felt the truth of this settle in her bones. "I know, but I've survived 9 years alone. I'll survive whatever comes next." Takoda set down his cup, leaning back in his chair. "There is strength in you. I see why you chose to help enemies. You do not see enemies, only people. Is that wrong? It is dangerous, but perhaps it is also necessary." He stood, moving toward the door. "My people leave tomorrow. The soldiers have been punished enough by their wounds and their fear. Let them go in peace when they are ready. And if they choose to stay?" Takoda paused at the threshold, looking back at her. "Then their fate is bound to yours, and yours to theirs. Choose wisely, Sarah Whitmore." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the gathering darkness, turning his words over in her mind. Choose wisely. But what was the wise choice? To send Elijah and Marcus away as soon as Marcus could ride, protecting herself from the complications they brought? Or to ask them to stay, to gamble on the possibility that she did not have to face the future alone? The question plagued her through the night and into the following days. The Apache scouts departed as Takoda had promised, disappearing into the landscape as if they had never been there. Marcus grew stronger, taking short walks around the property, his laughter returning along with his health, and Elijah became woven into the fabric of her days in ways that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He fixed the leak in her roof that she had been patching with tar for 3 years. He reorganized her woodpile, rebuilt the door to the chicken coop, replaced the cracked pane in her bedroom window. He worked with a quiet efficiency, never asking permission, simply seeing what needed doing and doing it. And when their hands brushed accidentally, when their eyes met across the dinner table, Sarah felt something inside her crack open, letting in light she had not realized she was missing. One afternoon, she found Elijah in the barn, grooming the horses with Marcus sitting nearby, offering commentary and jokes. The easy affection between them was obvious, beautiful in its openness, and Sarah felt a pang of something that might have been envy, or might have been recognition of her own loneliness. "You two are good together," she said, announcing her presence. Marcus grinned. "We are. Been that way for 5 years now. Met during the war, figured out pretty quickly that we were fighting for the wrong reasons, decided to fight for each other instead. That's brave, in a world that doesn't make room for what you have. Brave or foolish, depending on who you ask." Elijah's expression was serious, his eyes searching hers. "We've learned to take happiness where we find it and not apologize for it." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning beneath his words. "I think that might be the wisest thing anyone said to me in years." That night, unable to sleep again, she stood on her porch and watched the stars. The air was warm, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers she had planted years ago in a moment of optimism she barely remembered. She heard the barn door open and close, saw Elijah's silhouette approaching through the darkness. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. Neither spoke for a long time, content to exist in the shared silence. Finally, Sarah found the courage to voice the question that had been building inside her. "What will you do when Marcus is fully healed?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice carried a vulnerability she had not heard before. "We don't have anywhere we need to be. No family waiting, no home to return to. We've been drifting for a long time, looking for a place where we could just exist without constantly watching our backs." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." He turned to look at her, and even in the darkness, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "I keep thinking about what you said, about how we reminded you that you're capable of caring. You've done the same for us. Made us remember what it feels like to be treated with decency, to be seen as people instead of problems." Sarah's heart was beating too fast, her breath shallow with anticipation of something she could not name. "Elijah, He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, tracing the path of a tear she had not realized had fallen. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "Not despite everything you've survived, but because of it. Every line on your face, every scar, every moment of strength it took to keep going when you had every reason to give up. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Sarah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she let herself feel wanted for the first time in 9 years. His hand was warm and calloused, real and present, and she wanted to capture this moment, hold it safe against all the losses that had come before. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to let someone in again. Neither do I, not really, but maybe we figure it out together." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, and Sarah felt the question in the gesture, the invitation offered without pressure. She could step back, could retreat to the safety of isolation, or she could step forward into the terrifying possibility of connection. She chose to step forward. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question and an answer flowing between them. The kiss was gentle, almost chaste, but it carried within it the weight of all their loneliness, all their hope, all the courage it took to try again. Sarah's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of sensation, and Elijah's arms came around her, holding her close, but not constraining her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sarah found herself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Stay," she whispered. "Both of you. Stay as long as you want." Elijah's answering smile was radiant even in the darkness. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm choosing to try anyway." They stood together on the porch until the sky began to lighten in the east, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, building the foundation of something neither could quite name, but both desperately wanted. The following weeks brought a transformation to the way station. With 3 people working together, the property began to show signs of care it had lacked for years. Fences were mended, the well cleaned and reinforced, the house itself receiving attention that made it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Marcus, fully recovered, threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that was infectious. He and Elijah moved through tasks with the practiced coordination of people who knew each other intimately, and Sarah found herself drawn into their rhythm, becoming part of something larger than herself. But the peace was fragile, and Sarah knew it could not last. Ezra Callahan returned on a sweltering afternoon 3 weeks after his first visit, and this time he brought more than just ranch hands. 6 men rode with him, all armed, all wearing expressions that promised violence if they did not get what they wanted. Sarah met them at the gate, rifle in hand, Elijah and Marcus flanking her on either side. The message was clear. She was no longer alone. Ezra's face darkened when he saw her companions. "Still harboring deserters, I see. Still trespassing on my land, I see," Sarah countered. "This is your last chance, Sarah. Sell to me now, leave peacefully, or things get ugly. The only thing ugly here is your manners. Now get off my property before I start shooting." Ezra laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You going to shoot all 7 of us? You and your 2 friends?" Before Sarah could respond, another voice called out from behind Ezra's group. Takoda and a dozen Apache warriors appeared, seemingly from nowhere, surrounding Ezra's men with weapons drawn. "She's not alone," Takoda said calmly, "and you are trespassing on land that has been given protection." The color drained from Ezra's face. He looked from the Apache to Sarah, realization dawning. "You've allied with them?" "I've allied with decency, something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." Sarah raised her rifle, aiming squarely at Ezra's chest. "Leave, now, don't come back." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Ezra yanked his horse's reins, turning away. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Sarah said quietly, but with absolute conviction. She watched Ezra and his men ride away, watched until they disappeared completely, and only then did she lower her rifle. Takoda approached, dismissing his warriors with a gesture that sent them melting back into the landscape. "You have made an enemy," he observed. "I made an enemy years ago, when I refused to be bullied. Today, I just made it official." Takoda's lips curved in what might have been approval. "You fight well for someone who claims to want peace." "Peace doesn't mean rolling over when someone tries to take what's yours." He nodded slowly. "My people respect strength. You have shown strength. If you need our help again, send word." After Takoda left, Sarah turned to find Elijah and Marcus, watching her with expressions of mingled admiration and concern. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless," Elijah said. Sarah shrugged, suddenly exhausted. Brave and reckless seemed to go together lately. That evening, as they sat together around the dinner table, Marcus raised his cup in a toast. "To Sarah Whitmore, the bravest woman in the territory." Sarah felt her cheeks heat, but she raised her own cup. "To second chances, to finding family in unexpected places." Elijah's hand found hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers, and Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumble. She had spent 9 years protecting herself from pain by refusing to feel anything at all. But these 2 men, with their gentle strength and their obvious love for each other and their surprising capacity to include her in that love, had shown her that protection was just another word for prison. Later, as Sarah prepared for bed, she heard a soft knock on her bedroom door. She opened it to find both Elijah and Marcus standing there, uncertainty written across their faces. "We wanted to say goodnight properly," Elijah said. "If that's all right." Sarah stepped back, inviting them in, and they entered her private space with a reverence that made her heart ache. Elijah took her hand, bringing it to his lips, placing a kiss on her palm that felt like a promise. Marcus smiled at her, his expression warm and accepting. "We're not trying to push you," Marcus said softly. "We just want you to know that what we have, what Elijah and I share, there's room for you in it, if you want there to be." Sarah looked between them, seeing the honesty in their faces, the offer made without expectation or pressure. They were giving her a choice, a real choice, and the freedom of it was almost overwhelming. "I want," she whispered, "I want there to be room." Elijah pulled her close, his embrace warm and solid, and Marcus moved to stand beside them, his hand resting gently on her back. They stood together in the quiet of her bedroom, three people who had found each other against all odds, three people choosing to build something new from the wreckage of their pasts. Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of release, of the overwhelming recognition that she was no longer alone. She had spent so long believing that her life was over, that the best she could hope for was to survive until the end came. But here, in the arms of these two unexpected men, she understood that survival was not the same as living, and she had been given a gift, the chance to live again. The days that followed were filled with a contentment Sarah had forgotten existed. The three of them settled into a routine that felt natural, each contributing to the household, each finding their place in the delicate balance they were creating. Elijah taught her to shoot better, spent hours with her at the makeshift range he built, his body close behind hers as he corrected her stance. Marcus cooked meals that were far better than anything she had managed in years, filling the house with scents that made it feel like a home. And at night they came together in Sarah's room, the three of them tangled in her bed, sharing warmth and whispered conversations and touches that spoke of trust and growing affection. Nothing was rushed, nothing forced. They moved at the pace of Sarah's comfort, respecting her boundaries, celebrating each small step she took toward opening herself to intimacy again. One evening, as they lay together in the darkness, Marcus spoke into the quiet. "I never thought I'd find this. A place to belong, people to belong with." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "I thought I was done with wanting things." Elijah's arm tightened around her. "You deserve to want things. You deserve to have them too." Sarah turned in his embrace, finding his lips in the darkness, kissing him with a passion that had been building for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she felt Marcus's hand on her shoulder, turning her toward him, and she kissed him too, marveling at how different it felt, how perfectly it complemented the first kiss. "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "Both of you. I don't know how it happened so fast, but I do." "We love you too," Elijah said, and Marcus nodded his agreement, his fingers threading through her hair. They made love that night, the three of them together, moving with a tenderness and consideration that made Sarah feel cherished in ways she had never experienced. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty, only the deep rightness of bodies and hearts aligning. And when she finally fell asleep, wrapped in their arms, she felt complete for the first time in her adult life. Months passed, and the way station thrived. Word spread that Sarah Whitmore was under the protection of both her armed companions and the Apache, and travelers began to stop more frequently, paying for water and shelter, bringing news from other parts of the territory. The income was modest but steady, enough to make real improvements to the property. Ezra Callahan never returned, though Sarah heard rumors that he had sold his ranch and moved north, defeated by her stubborn refusal to be intimidated. The war between settlers and Apache continued in other parts of the territory, but around Sarah's way station, an unofficial peace held, built on the foundation of mutual respect and the memory of shared water. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah spoke the thought that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "I want to make this permanent. I want us to be a family, officially." Elijah and Marcus exchanged glances, and Sarah saw hope and uncertainty warring in their expressions. The world doesn't make room for families like ours, Marcus said gently. Then we make the room ourselves. I don't care what the world thinks. I care about you two, and I want to build a life together that doesn't have an expiration date. Elijah took her hand, his grip tight. Are you sure? Really sure? I've never been more sure of anything. They sealed the commitment that night, not with official papers or ceremonies the world would recognize, but with promises spoken in the darkness, with rings fashioned from silver and turquoise that Dakota's wife had helped Sarah design, with the deep knowing that what they had built was real and worthy and theirs. The territory remained dangerous, the future uncertain, but Sarah Whitmore no longer faced it alone. She had Elijah's steady strength, Marcus's warm laughter, and the growing network of allies who had seen her courage and chosen to support it. On a clear morning in late autumn, Sarah stood on her porch and looked out over the land she had fought to keep. The way station was no longer a place of mere survival, but a home filled with love and purpose. She thought of the woman she had been a year ago, hollow and resigned, and barely recognized her. Elijah came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. Marcus joined them a moment later, carrying coffee, and the three of them stood together, watching the sun rise over the desert. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "For what?" Elijah asked. "For asking for water. For giving me a reason to remember that kindness matters." Marcus smiled. "Thank you for giving it to us, for seeing us as worth saving." They stood in comfortable silence. Three people who had found each other in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Three people who had chosen love over fear, connection over isolation. The road ahead would not be easy, Sarah knew that, but she was no longer walking it alone, and that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, if you found yourself longing for the same courage Sarah discovered, remember that it's never too late to choose kindness, never too late to open the door to possibility. In the hardest places, in the most unexpected moments, love can still take root and grow. All it requires is the courage to offer water to a stranger and the wisdom to see where that simple act of decency might lead.